I'd like to introduce Kerry Adams of the Cleveland Restoration Society. He's been with the Cleveland Restoration Society for about 6 years in the Heritage Home Loan Program. Today, Kerry works with homeowners in Lakewood and Lorain County to provide technical assistance and to facilitate low-interest loans. He also serves on the Detroit Shoreway and Brooklyn Center Historic District Design Review Committees as well. Prior to his tenure at the Cleveland Restoration Society, Kerry served as curator and site manager at a historic house museum in Ann Arbor and also in Dayton, Ohio. He was the curator of collections at Hale Farm and Village, where he managed the $1.2 million restoration of the 1820s Jonathan and Sarah Kozad Hale house. So we're really lucky to have him here today, and he's going to talk to you about the American home interior. And also, I think afterwards, we'll hold questions as best we can till after. And then he also has some materials over there and some resource papers for you to take away with you. With that, let's give Kerry a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. I may have to adjust the microphone a little bit, but I will try to talk as loud as possible. One of the things that I really liked doing was putting this presentation together, because there are so many times when we are always talking about historic preservation and the exteriors of a house, but we haven't always given as much emphasis on authentic restoration of an interior space. And one of the ways that American culture has really learned about historic interiors is through their experiences with some kind of a museum setting. And that has had its various shades of birth and rebirth over time. But Mount Vernon, of course, was the first national historic shrine. And then in the 1920s, with a lot of industrialists investing in historic properties, we saw the rise of historic Williamsburg in Virginia, and then Deerfield in New England, and then also the assemblage of villages in various locations throughout the country, one of them being Greenfield Village in Michigan and Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, the main focus of those institutions at that time was really showing off this humongous cache of artifacts that the directors, the curators, the financial backers had really amassed. And they were really focused on what we'd always call the great white man syndrome. If you weren't wealthy, white, and male, they didn't really talk about your history. But that has changed since the 1970s. And a lot of that was just through the use of more social history and material culture research. And one example that I have is to kind of illustrate the point that I'm going to make tonight through the presentation is one of the homes in Deerfield, the Wells-Thorn house, and I believe this was open to the public in the 1960s. And so the south parlor, in the images you see here, the black and white photo on the left represents the 1960s installation of that building. And so you see, this, as I said, this tremendous assemblage of artifacts, the best of everything, very homey, obviously has a very comforting look to it and feel to it, with the oriental carpets and the easy chair and the highboy and everything. But by the 1980s, the curators at the institution were getting wise to some things that they realized that this was not really how people actually lived in the 18th century. So what they did was they went back through probate inventories. Now, how many of you have heard about them or know of them? Okay, more than the other night. That's good. Probate inventories, as you knew, they're done at the time someone passes away. They have probably a few folks come through the house and they do a literal inventory of what's in the house. And those records are part of the probate document then. to kind of document what's the value of the estate. Now, obviously, from one appraiser to another, they might be more or less specific as to what they saw, and everybody had their own bias as to what things were valued at. But it is one primary document that we have to go back to give us a real roadmap as to people's actual consumption patterns. So what I'm leading to is that the photograph on the right is the exact same room as it was reinstalled by probe and inventory research. They found that the parlor in a house of this period did not contain those hundreds of objects, but it contained the best bedstead in the house and usually, you know, a chest of drawers, but obviously not the tremendous display that you saw. So it really changed our concept of how did people live. So curators kind of look at all those little teeny tiny pieces of evidence to put together a furnishings plan. So they look at a lot of primary source materials, architectural style and date of the house. Often they consult or create a historic structure report that documents the changes to the house over time. But they look at the social and economic factors of the families. And really lastly, they kind of compile all this research and then they select the most compelling era of the house's history to present a story, because you want to draw in your audience and you want to make it captivating and interesting. So if you don't have any journals from the first occupant that lived there, but you have 12 volumes of the third family, maybe your focus should shift to a later time period. The investigation and interpretation leads, you know, into such things as looking at what we call the forensic evidence of the house itself, research on period interpretation, social customs, foodways. Historic paint analysis also helps to provide a better picture of what were the actual paint colors that they used. And then, you know, putting everything together, and that is how was the house furnished per the period. We would put chairs in the one location today, but they put them in different locations based on what period the house is representing. So one of my favorite shots is this chronology of wallpaper, and that is from one room in one building in New England. So it gave you the whole history of someone's decorating trends. They just kept plastering it on top of each other. But Historic New England has done a great job at really historic preservation and museum studies throughout the region. And so we'll kind of get started into the early Victorian home. And some folks have commented like that I call it all Victorian, whereas some people might not term it that way. But really, I'm kind of going off of Queen Victoria, 1830s. She was in power in England. So we have three kind of major styles that were prominent in the early 19th century: Grecian Revival, Gothic Revival, and Rococo Revival. And so I've kind of, for each time period we're talking about tonight, I've listed a few of the motifs and some of the trendsetters. So you might be able to pick out, you know, I've heard of Asher Benjamin, or I know about Henry Belter or Belter Furniture. And those are just some of the things that kind of fall into each time period. With the Grecian Revival, obviously they were pulling from classical Roman and Greek forms, so the furniture tended to be more massive and kind of architectural. And a lot of this was some of the early mass-produced furniture in the country, where the frames were made out of pine or poplar substrate, and then they had mahogany veneer applied over top of them so that they had a much more expensive look. And as you can tell, a lot of the furniture is very massive in scale, very masculine look to it. And then by the 1840s, a new style was kind of coming on the horizon, and that was the Gothic Revival. Really most prominently discussed by Andrew Jackson Downing, who kind of wrote one of the first books, and I'm going to call him the first Martha Stewart in this presentation, because he wrote a book that told you how you should build your house, how you should landscape it, how you should furnish it, and how you should paint it. And so this is a page out of one of his books. And so he was espousing this style that, I mean, Gothic, obviously, anything that looked like a church, that fits into that style. So everything from a small shelf clock down to a piece of large furniture. And then Rococo Revival. I know that this is not a great slide in terms of the furniture. It's a little bit dark, but the Rococo is drawing from the French style, and Rococo is like many curves, I think is the actual name for that, the translation of that word. So as mass production of furniture began to, became more, better qualities of furniture were made, and as they perfected their technique, steam bending furniture became more common, so they could add more ornament to it. And this is where that belter furniture fits into the time period. Early Victorian interiors, obviously we didn't have the aid of photography, so we often look to some of the itinerant painters of the time period to give us a real slice of life as to you know, how did people dress, how did they furnish their homes, and it also gives us an idea of the color palettes that they used during the time period. So one of my favorite images of that era is the one on the left, where it's kind of the family portrait, but you know that there's something more going on. They're really kind of showing off. They're just saying, like, look, you know, we have 4 children, and they're still living. And we have, you know, some mass-produced store-bought furniture. We have a fancy sewing table with veneer. We have store-bought carpet on the floor, and we have a nice house that has exterior shutters. So just all in this teeny tiny little slice, you get an idea that they're really telling folks that they've kind of arrived in culture. And then with the aid of photography in the 1850s and 60s, we got kind of the first glimpse of actual interiors. And this is a home in Boston that was photographed. A couple of things that's kind of interesting, and these are, you see the use of vines as a window treatment. That was often done like in the summer season. It was in a plan book or a magazine of the era. And also the fact that they had wall-to-wall carpet. We often think of anything pre-1900, there was no wall-to-wall carpet, but these pictures show that. And also just the accumulation of objects over time. The piano down in the far right is a little older than some of the Rococo Revival chairs. So it's just as you would purchase in your own home. It was kind of a, you know, as you had the means to buy it, you added to. So it wasn't all one style and all perfect. And this is another interior from Richmond, Kentucky. A little different, you know, settlement and culture hearth. This is kind of getting into that whole southern culture, and you know, the scenic painting on the wall, the mural. And this gives you a real great representation of the parlor kind of as the family museum, or you know, where all the ancestral portraits are hung. And obviously they're kind of showing off. They have some musical instruments, so there's a level of refinement and culture. One of the greatest things that we always found kind of interesting to do when we were working in a museum environment was to show the interiors at different points throughout the seasons of the year. And so even though it was a lot of work for us in the 1990s, it was just as much work, if not more, in the 19th century to actually summarize your house, because a lot of the concerns of the day would include bug infestation of wool carpets and draperies, so they were often taken down and put away. And the furniture was often covered in black horsehair material, and I've got a little sample I'm going to pass around. So the horsehair was often covered for protection as well in the summer heat, and they used like a muslin slipcover like in the illustration here. But another major no-no was having an open firebox in the middle of summer. That was just, you just didn't do that. So they often put in a fireboard that was wallpapered to match the room, and covered that over for the summer because they weren't going to need it and they didn't want to look at it all summer. So floor coverings, some of the basic floor coverings that they had during the early 19th century were floorcloths, the predecessor of modern linoleum, which is basically canvas that's painted and then gessoed and varnished. And these are really common for a dining room or a hallway where you had a lot of traffic and you had food spills that you wanted to clean up. So it was just a very practical floor covering. And again, it could mimic a more expensive flooring material that if you couldn't afford marble, you could paint something to look like marble. The other thing is, in this really early photo too, is this view of a bedroom that shows the woven straw matting that was often tacked down to the floor as an underlayment for the carpet. And then in the summertime, as it was exposed because the carpets would be put away for the season. And you can see too that the window treatments have all been taken down for the summer. They probably have like louvered shutters on the outside of the house so they could control light and heat a little bit with that. So it's a great shot of that early time period. Some of the other kinds of floor coverings they did have available were two kinds of mass-produced goods that were available to the middle class. One was Venetian carpet, and this is just a stripe carpet that is woven from wool. And I'm going to pass an example of this around as well. But this was more of like a durable carpet that had a bit of heft to it, so you could use it on a staircase or in a sitting room or something that was not as formal as maybe your front parlor. But if you were, like they had in the picture before, you're a wealthy family or up and coming, you might be able to afford an ingrain carpet. So you could select a variety of patterns. And these are just like those woven coverlets for your beds. The colors reverse if you flip them over. And oftentimes they did that for durability. They, once it was starting to wear out on the one side, they'd flip it over and use the other side. And then, of course, the most expensive carpet is something we still have today. That's the heavy woven carpet that has a canvas backing, and it was either a looped pile or a cut pile. Those are both available, but they're really a short pile in comparison to what we have today. So these are just some representations of some of the reproduction carpets that are still being reproduced today. And you can tell the patterns are very symmetrical, very classical in nature, tying in with the design motif of the era. Wallpaper of the period also brought those geometric forms to the walls, and they use simplified organic forms as well. So these are just, again, some reproduction papers of that period. And then, things are getting more pattern here, but still that 1840 to 60 era. One of the really common things that people, if you had a large house with a central hallway, they often installed an ashlar block wallpaper because it had a classical tone to it, but it also was easy to repair. If you had a lot of little kids running around, as they did, the hallway was probably one room of the house that you had more damage. So, if a pencil or scissors or something, like, or a kid just started pulling the wallpaper off the wall, you could often cut out a square or two and then glue in the replacement, and no one would ever know that there was a little repair there. The other thought process behind this type of pattern for a hallway was that they wanted things to be fairly neutral, so that none of the wallpapers in the rooms coming off the hall would clash with the hallway. So it was often either a beige or sometimes like a stone, gray stone look to it. How many of you have seen faux marble or grain painted finishes? Okay, so a lot of us probably thought, well, those were invented in the 80s when people started to be a little more crafty. But it actually goes back to the 18th century, and it continued really into the early 20th century. And this is just a couple examples of if you're building a house in the early 19th century, you had to rely on local lumber, which wasn't always, you got what you got. You know, if you couldn't find mahogany, that was, not available here anyway. You could have poplar or pine painted to look like that mahogany veneer or oak. And so you could have, a lot of times there was an itinerant artist that would travel the countryside, and that's all they did. They either painted portraits or they painted houses. And the other thing that they could do as well was to marbleize finishes in the house. And so often that was done for a mantelpiece, because marble was really expensive to ship and to get across the country with our really pretty treacherous road system, or non-existent road system at the time. So it was another little trick of the eye, really, that you could get that accomplished. Window treatments of the era, again, drew from the classical drapery of Greece and Rome, so things were kind of a flowing, natural form. And one of the things that we often just have no concept of is that the American home has gone through this transformation socially and culturally, that the second floor of your house or your bedrooms were often not public space. So even your best friend would probably rarely know what your bedroom looks like, because that was just socially, the mores were, that was just not acceptable. So often you could kind of get away with maybe a little less expensive goods upstairs, and then save your money to splurge downstairs where everybody would see it. So in this case, they did use muslin fabric as a window treatment in the summertime. And the middle photo here, you can see, maybe it's not real distinct, but there's some little orange dots along the top of the window casing there. Those correspond to tack marks that we found. And then on the left and right of the window, you can see little marks that indicate where the tiebacks for the curtains were located. So it gave us evidence to install a window treatment that was literally tacked right to the window casing itself. There was no hardware at all. Very utilitarian, but functional. And as you can see, the window curtain on the far right, a lot of them were able to draw up kind of like a Roman shade, so you could control light and heat throughout the day with something as simple as brass rings and a string on the back of it. And of course, downstairs, you could splurge a little bit more, and you could have more heavy brocaded fabrics or wool fabrics, and you had gilded wooden hardware, and they were still using Venetian blinds, which was kind of a carryover from the 18th century. And again, used in places where they were really concerned about food, odors permeating the cloth. So places like dining rooms, or maybe even a library, where they, wanted a different atmospheric look, kind of preserve the books. they installed those, and again, they could be opened and closed throughout the day. Lighting, again, was very primitive up until after the Civil War, really. So most people still relied on candles, which, you know, if you had to make them for the entire year, that was a nice little winter project. Making your tallow candles or your beeswax candles. And there were some families who had, you know, middle-class wealth, and they could purchase some of the early forms of oil lamps that relied on a substance called camphene, which was a refined combination of alcohol and turpentine. So it was a very volatile substance, as I'm getting the reaction in the room. And so it was very expensive too. It was like $1.26 a gallon in about 1850. So most people didn't have thousands of oil lamps in their house because they couldn't afford to keep them running. So the only places that you might have them before the Civil War would be your hallway, maybe your center table in the parlor, and possibly like a hand lamp or something where you wanted to, you know, move around the house, light some candles, that kind of thing. So again, really sparing use of oil lighting in that early period. The late Victorian home, obviously you can see from the photo, everything has changed. After the Civil War, the kind of second industrial revolution takes place. Things can be mass produced at a much lower cost, and we start to see railroads transporting goods across the country, and then the rise of the catalog order system from Sears Roebuck to Montgomery Ward, where every farmer way out in the middle of nowhere could order just about anything they needed from a catalog and have it shipped to the local railroad station. So you had much more consumer goods available at a lower price, and the trend was then to amass more stuff as a show of wealth. And during this period, from about 1870 to 1900, the two major styles are the Renaissance Revival and the Eastlake. Renaissance, of course, taking from the Italian style, and then Eastlake drawing from the British, kind of the early folks who were the early arts and crafts folks, I guess, if you will. So mass-produced furnishings, really common after the Civil War, and this picture illustrates that even Ulysses S. Grant, one of our presidents, had dining room chairs that came right out of a catalog. The picture on the upper left there is like almost an exact copy of his dining room chair. So it really, you know, anybody of any kind of economic level made use of that. The furniture, like I said, Renaissance Revival, the Italian style, you can almost see some of these furnishings as a piece of architecture, like an Italian palazzo or something with these big architectural cartouches and heavy moldings. You know, it's a really commanding presence in the room. And then you see kind of a departure from that through the Eastlake style, which didn't rely as much on built-up, heavy, applied ornament and carvings, but actually carving out the surface, where you have these incised lines, some of which were more mass-produced than hand-created. But you see a more simplicity of form, and you can see it kind of moving in the direction of the arts and crafts movement. And of course, during this time period, the big, like, we've arrived, we have the 45-inch flat screen TV, was the fact that you could afford a mass-produced, store-bought Parlor Suite. And that often came in like a 7-piece kit. So you had a settee, you had 4 side chairs, you had mom's chair and dad's throne, usually. There's a little size difference there. Dad's chair's a little higher, a little bigger. And so that really was kind of a show of wealth. And you've probably, if you've scoured antique shops throughout the years, you may have seen, some pictures of farm families in front of their little, Greek Revival farmhouse or their folk Victorian farmhouse, and they're sitting there and there's a big pump organ behind them and a parlor table and a few other things that really are like, they hauled the furniture out to show off the fact that, look what all we have. But obviously, this environment kind of leads into the topic of more consumption of goods. The catalogs during the time had furniture suites that were available in all different price points. So whether you were just starting out or maybe you were replacing something, you could buy something at every level. Sometimes it just changed a little bit. The more expensive version had a marble top instead of a wooden top. More carving if you had more money. So late Victorian interiors, we see the rise of photography even more. And in fact, some families are starting to use it as a hobby where they can develop their own glass plate negatives at home, take candid shots of the family, or take some shots of their home. And so these illustrate kind of really, unapologetic look at everyday life. And I'm sure they were staged a little bit and dusted and cleaned up, but they show you how much pattern had moved not just from the walls but up to the ceiling in the location of additional types of wallpaper, curtains still being hung in a similar fashion to earlier in the period, but the use of lace curtains was very prominent during the era. And these are a couple other great shots that show families kind of in their own environment. The one on the left, I'm not certain, but I suspect that maybe this was a smaller house, and maybe this was a sitting room that doubled as a couple different uses, because they have a lamp, one of those lamps that pulls down from the ceiling, or you can push it back up. So they may have used the room for different functions throughout the day. And so it's kind of one of those multi-purpose inventions, really, that hadn't occurred until after the Civil War. And then, of course, the picture on the right is it's just funny, because it's like, how many photographs can we have on the wall? every piece of, every ancestor is over here. And again, Wilton and Ingrain carpets really kind of take over center stage as the most common types of coverings. Just the patterns changed a little bit, but the same technique and process in manufacturing as prior to the war. And then wallpaper starts to pull in what we call that kind of muddy brown and gold rust-colored period of the 1880s and 90s. If any of you have lived in an old Victorian house, or you've researched exterior paint colors, there's a whole section in some of those books about the gold and brown period that was really common, not only outside but inside as well. So you can see the use of some of the more natural plant-made types of colorways that were used during the period. Geometric shapes take more of a prominence here. And then instead of looking at, England or France or Italy, they're starting to look to the Far East for inspiration. So this Alhambra wallpaper, anything kind of like exotic and Middle Eastern, was kind of the rage during the 1880s and 90s. And this is a view of the Harvey Firestone birthplace in Greenfield Village, which gives you a good idea of really an 1820s house that was updated in the 1880s by the second generation. So Grandma's china closet is still in the corner of the room, but they've purchased mass-produced dining room chairs and table, and then they put together this, as we call it, kind of wacky wallpaper and border combination that we would never think of today. This really dark border at the top, and then a lighter ground paper. And then again, you've got this, like, turkey red carpet on the floor. It's just kind of all that pattern is like screaming out at you. But it's just it's a good representation of an interior of that time. And then as the century moved on, you know, and wallpaper was becoming more and more widely used, folks were really probably pulling their hair out as to like, what do I put together if I just have to look at these books and come up with something? So then they started to develop things into a room set. So you'd have a ceiling paper that coordinated with a wallpaper and a border. So you didn't have to make those really tough choices. So these are some Bradbury wallpapers and some Victorian collectibles that are reproduced today. And then kind of the height of everything was the room set. And this is a Bradbury and Bradbury reproduction, but it just shows you how detailed those late 19th century interiors became, where you had every surface covered in some kind of pattern, and the ceiling wasn't just one wallpaper, it was like a combination of 4 different wallpapers, because you had to have a border and you had to have a corner block. You couldn't just have, you know, one ceiling paper. So you can imagine what's coming soon. Window treatments, like I said earlier, the way that they hung them on the window really hadn't changed a whole lot, but mass production techniques provided folks with a wider variety of, you know, you could choose different finial types or brackets for the curtain rods. And so like the image on the upper right is really from Charles Locke Eastlake's book, Hints on Household Taste from the 1870s, but the image below it is from a 1902 Sears Roebuck catalog. So things changed, but they didn't change every 5 or 10 years or whatever we are. Our cycle now is like really fast. The other thing that they did have available were wooden and brass, like stamped metal window cornices that sometimes could be paired with draperies or Venetian blinds. This one is a wooden substrate, and then it was grain painted to look like I think it was like a walnut and a burl wood finish. Window treatments, these are some reproduction lace panels. So you can see, just like the wallpaper, that overall pattern was very popular during the era. And then lighting, as I said, after the Civil War, the use of kerosene became much more perfected, so that brought the cost of lighting your house way down so that many more people could afford that. And so these kinds of fixtures were available through mail order and through your local general store. And so you could have a variety of devices for the situation, whether you wanted a wall lamp or a ceiling or a table lamp. You had a variety of choices. And then we move into gas lighting. And I know that there were some older communities on the eastern seaboard that had gas lighting, like in the 1840s and 50s, but for most of us, we just didn't have that all perfected out here yet. So it wasn't really as commonly used until the late 19th century. And so houses were wired, or they were plumbed for gas lines in the ceiling, or wall sconces. But one of the funny things that I found, and I had to include it in this slide, was that the photograph here on the right is like a catalog order that you could find fixtures through. And it's a combination of electric and gas, because they weren't quite sure yet if that electricity was going to stick around. So they wanted the backup of the gas lighting. So you can see the gas is usually the jet that goes straight up, and then the electric is the one that's pointing downward. So obviously with all those Victorian excesses, everybody was really tired of all that. Took a little while for everyone to adjust to it, but it was a good time for people to kind of react to change as we moved into a new century. So we moved into the arts and crafts period, where we were looking at some of the European trendsetters like William Morris, Charles Ruskin, and some of those folks, and then kind of added some of our own mix, Gustav Stickley and Frank Lloyd Wright. And this time period was really the first time, too, in the history of the country when our culture moved from the West Coast to the East Coast. It had always gone in the opposite direction. But at this time, the state of California was starting to develop. The movie industry was in its infancy, and they were starting to embrace the bungalow house type to suit their climate and their culture. So you see that moving then across the country in the opposite direction, and then the use of more simplified lines, the look of kind of old world craftsmanship, and then the rejection of all the mass-produced excesses that we saw during the Victorian period. And then kind of the easiest way to illustrate this was just to look at two floor plans that are, about 25 years apart maybe. And you can see on the left, in a Victorian floor plan, all those teeny tiny little specialized spaces, and they kind of represent the socialization of the people at the time, where the hallway was kind of like the waiting room. You couldn't really just go into the parlor because you had to be shown into the parlor, and you had to like put your calling card in, and you had to be approved before you could go into the next room. And then after World War I, things were simplified that you walked right into the living room. There was no extra chamber there. The spaces are much more open. Rooms kind of flow off of each other more easily than they did before. And this is a Sears catalog house. And the photos are from, it's the same house. I kind of pulled them from two different places. But the photos are from like an Iowa State Fair or something. So they were showing off this house like, you can buy this through the catalog, and then of course you can buy everything inside of it from Sears Roebuck. But it's a great illustration of how the living room and dining room kind of started to blend together into one space during the period. And then this shows that there really isn't any wallpaper. There looks like there's a little stencil or maybe a border in that one room, but you can see, total simplification of pattern in the room. And these are some historic photographs of the era. I think most of these are like Minnesota or Wisconsin, but they show, again, like, painted walls, natural woodwork, floors finally being covered with those oriental carpets that, we used to think were 18th century, but they really weren't. And the window treatments are so simple you don't even see the hardware anymore, because they're really showing off the natural woodwork. Even though the dining room set is kind of arts and crafts, it still has some of that kind of colonial touch. So it's sort of like, they were kind of teetering in between the two periods of Colonial Revival and arts and crafts. And then these are a few other illustrations from some house catalogs of the time period. And then this is from the Craftsman magazine. So you can see kind of a renewed focus on the frieze as kind of the only main ornament in the house, that was tied in with the natural use of colors, that tied with your tile work and your carpeting and upholstery. And then these are some William Morris carpet reproductions. So you can kind of see that symmetry and some stylized natural forms are taking prominence here during the period. And then wallpaper, again, pulls from not so much those really more vibrant colors, but looking at the natural colors that were found in nature. So they're looking at more kind of the patinated, verdigris and bronze, copper tones, that kind of thing. And then here's a couple other decorative frieze papers that were common during the era when the ceilings were a little bit lower than the older Victorian houses. But many of you maybe who have a house with a plate rail or something like that have wondered what might have been between the ceiling and that rail. You may have had a frieze paper like that. And then often dining rooms with a little more ornament had paneled wall below that, which sometimes had panels or just a plastered surface with the wooden corner or the wooden casing around it. So those could be wallpapered to coordinate with the wall above it. And then window treatments, there's still a use of lace curtains, but then they did get into really natural fibers like linen that had that kind of old world handmade feel going back to kind of medieval times. I'll pass this around. And like we saw in some of the photographs, you can't even see the window hardware because it's all these new concealed rods that are screwed into the side of the window casing so that you kind of can show off more the architecture of the space with the lines of the room. And so these are a few examples of some of the period window treatments. Obviously simple, you have lace, but you have it now only used in a border situation, or just this really geometric repeating pattern. And obviously lighting, as you've all seen, anything that looks like an old lantern, smells like an old lantern, was really what was most popular. So if you had, they looked to nature for inspiration, so they had glass light fixture globes that looked like lilies or tulips. Mica was used as a way to kind of give that amber glow to light bulbs. And then you had the continuation of sort of that art and craft through the use of leaded and stained glass windows and then also lighting fixtures. But of course, as we found with everything else, one thing leads to a reaction on some other level. So when they were really tired of everything being spare and really dark and natural, we wanted to lighten things up a bit. So after the centennial of the country in 1876, there was the first time that we really kind of looked at our own history as a design inspiration. So we were no longer saying, oh, the Italians are really cool, let's pull from that, or we love the French, let's do that. We were looking to that colonial New England touch. So you saw a lot of the woodwork being painted in a white color or lighter shades, the return of classical crown moldings and other molding forms, and kind of the most elaborate probably thing in the house was the mantelpiece as kind of the symbol of hearth and home. It had returned after we kind of sort of perfected modern heating systems, whether they were coal or steam boilers. We could have a wood-burning fireplace again, and didn't have to rely on stoves, so that took center stage. And furniture of the time period, as you can imagine, anything that they could reproduce that looked slightly oldie-timey or colonial, Queen Anne Jacobean Revival, anything like that. Anything from like a higher end company like Kittinger to Sears Roebuck was making something that kind of brought that classical, formal 18th century style back into the home. And then, during that time period as well, Americans had more leisure time than we did in the past. So the furniture got a little bit more overstuffed. And we lost that 7-piece parlor suite, but we narrowed it down to 3 pieces: mom's chair, dad's chair, and the sofa. And even they got a little cabriole leg at the bottom, so they could be sort of Queen Anne. But probably one of the most unusual inventions of the period was kind of that obsession in the early 20th century with the rise of the factories, of kind of this health movement and sanitary movement. And so there was a renewed emphasis on fresh air. Probably many of you have lived in or have a house that has like a sun porch or a sleeping porch or a sunroom. Those were all part of that time period. And it was another room that you could furnish more informally, that you could use during the day or during the afternoon or evening. And you can kind of see here where it's not meant to be the show place. It's just a place to kind of hang out. Again, the interiors were simplified from the Victorian, and with the use of moldings and fireplaces. But here's a couple other views of things like wingback chairs and Windsor chairs that were kind of tweaked a little bit in form. They maybe were made a little taller, a little narrower, and chest of drawers has sort of an 18th century look, but with the mirror and then the new form, it's just updated slightly for the time period. And then that really, actually, Colonial Revival or traditional interiors really continues into today. But by the 1940s, this is kind of what you'd expect to see, in houses where you had really formal, heavy draperies. You couldn't even hardly see the windows. Wall-to-wall carpeting was much more common, and you had mahogany veneered furniture in a variety of styles that was available. And then kind of those floral print fabrics came into vogue. And then floors, this is where we saw kind of like the continuation from the arts and crafts, that you had hardwood floors that you put a throw rug on, whether it was an oriental carpet or a braided rug or rag rug. You were still sometimes, showing off that hardwood surface as kind of a nod to our colonial roots. And then wallpapers, as you can imagine, they brought back all those kind of late 18th century or early 19th century, very traditional, stylized forms of kind of the urns and the swags and stripes and anything that looked somewhat like Hepplewhite or Sheraton in style. And then, how many of you guys thought that sponge painting was invented in the 1980s? I did, actually, until I saw this thing. The Sherwin-Williams catalog, it's a little tiny booklet that I found somewhere at an antique store, 1935, and they're showing off sponge painting. Like 3 different colors and a border. These might be those kinds of like pebbled plaster walls that had some texture anyway, and they were just trying to heighten that a little bit more with color. So you see kind of that movement away from wallpaper to a point, and the use of some other, stenciling was a colonial touch. So they're kind of reviving that. And then the paint colors became that lighter, more pastel palette that we'd kind of associate with colonial. And kind of moving away from the really dark natural tones of the arts and crafts. And then window treatments, you still had the use of lace, but again, it was again simplified, combination of plain grounds with like a lace edging. So again, kind of a little bit of a nod to the past, but somewhat simplification and movement toward the future. More windows. That curtain rod has been around for over 100 years, which kind of scares me. That patent telescoping curtain rod, the cheap rod that you can buy just about anywhere today, has been in use since 1907. And it was an easy way to put a curtain up and take it down, and you didn't have a lot of fancy ornament to dust and maintain when you're looking at simplified window treatments. And then again, yeah, renewed interest in Venetian blinds, both sort of as a colonial touch, but really used more, you know, with an Art Deco interior. And then obviously lighting, just like arts and crafts, anything that sort of looked like a lantern or a candle sconce or a chandelier that could have been, you know, in Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. Then they reproduced it into an electric light fixture. And they created some things too, like the bowl fixtures here on the bottom left. But things really started to change after World War II, when we had a major housing shortage and we had all these people coming back from the war, and I think it was like 16 years of pent-up demand because the housing market had shrunk during the Depression. There was a little boom around 1940, but then with the war, and then it kind of shrunk back down. So you have all this pent-up demand. You have, you know, people kind of in smaller quarters because they have to. And so they finally got to move forward with plans and design schemes that really had been in place since the 1920s, but there was no way to make those effective. And mid-century modern really draws itself out of the Bauhaus movement in Germany. Walter Gropius was one of the members of the Bauhaus, and they were the first to kind of build those kind of big ice cube, you know, square buildings that are concrete block or something and stuccoed, and they have steel casement windows and a flat roof. And they thought it looked cool, and it was a total shift from anything we'd seen before. But then, of course, Adolf Hitler came in to power, and he didn't want to see any more of that. So he kicked them all out, and so a lot of them immigrated to the States. And Walter Gropius was one of them who wound up teaching architecture at Harvard. And so he built a little kind of a neighborhood of houses for himself and some of his friends in this kind of Art Deco, streamlined, modern style with a flat roof. And some of their ideas in terms of simplification of line and form, prefabrication, and sparing use of materials didn't translate exactly into the ranch house, but it was kind of the basic blueprint for what the ranch house became. Some other trendsetters of the time were Russell Wright and Charles and Ray Ames, and the case study houses, which were built, most of them were built in California, but they were kind of those really modern houses that were all glass and had a steel frame. And this is an early ranch house in Dallas, Texas. That's a good illustration of how the floor plans were simplified after the war. Materials, let me see if I can get this right. Land was inexpensive if you were far enough away from the city, but there were higher wages, but there was higher inflation. So it was more expensive to build a house. So that also kind of tied into less use of material. So you had narrower door and window casings, fewer walls, so you had streamlined construction. So this is a great shot at kind of the living dining area rather than the two separate rooms. And then Frank Lloyd Wright's use of kind of Asian-inspired architecture in his Usonian houses were the other piece of the ranch house. And so there was this emphasis, again, like the arts and crafts and the bungalow, on the horizontal line. And you can see that illustrated here in the use of the Roman brick, because it's very narrow, so your eye is kind of drawn more to the horizon. And the open floor plan dictates kind of the new use of furnishings or fewer furnishings, because a lot of times there were built-in cabinets for storage. And the Museum of Modern Art actually, I think it's 1940 or 1950, they started a series of exhibits on what they called good design. And it included everything from like a can opener to a chair, tables, you know, basic linens, that kind of thing, just really espousing pure forms and ergonomics. And that's what you kind of see started to carry through into the mid-century modern. Eichler houses of the time period, this was a California developer who built things on this kind of A-frame concept with the post and beam construction. And you can see the beginnings, well, this is kind of not the beginnings, but it's sort of the antithesis of indoor space and outdoor space is all one and the same. And here's a view of an interior. And obviously, with different production techniques after the war, we found a lot of different things through experimentation and perfection just to create war material. We use those then into the domestic market. So we started to see furniture that was made out of molded fiberglass. We'd never seen that before. And, you know, kind of this Bauhaus square inspired Mondrian looking bookcase that was all plywood and metal frames, you know, incredibly sturdy, but, you know, could be knocked down and reassembled. And I think one of the funny stories I read about the Ames chairs is that they actually had like 4 or 5 people sit in like molds of clay so that they could get the perfect shape to make those chairs into. So it was comfortable for a wider range of people than just, you know, Charles Ames himself or something. So it's kind of one of those cute little behind the scenes stories. Now, obviously not everybody wanted to live like the Jetsons. So you could still have wooden furniture, but a lot of times it was simplified from earlier styles. You saw lighter woods being used. And kind of this casual entertaining started to take prominence in the culture. And that was espoused by a husband and wife team, Mary and Russell Wright, and I'm calling them the second Martha Stewart for the evening, because they, just like Martha, had, you know, this book to talk about their ideas, and then of course they had a whole line of products to sell you. So they had anything from the dinnerware that a lot of us are familiar with, but they also had a textile line, they had a small furniture line, so they were trying to help folks create a total environment. But they were some of the first people who were really successful at telling the American public that it's okay to entertain in a more casual manner. There's some illustrations in the book that show people at a dinner party and everybody's like lined up in the kitchen because they're like scooping out the soup from the pot on the stove, and then they're just going over to the table and picking up their plate, and it's all good. You know, it doesn't have to be real formal anymore. We don't have as much space in our little ranch house for formality. But it was just kind of one really common advent of that time period. And then obviously, you know, furniture that is becoming collectible again today, like Haywood Wakefield, maple furniture, hardwoods, but a lot less ornamentation was also really common. And you did see with, this modern thing, you did see kind of a easing back to that early American look of the time with the hutch, the open hutch, and maple furniture, but it looked more colonial in flavor. So you had kind of two trends going at the same time. But obviously, wallpapers and fabrics of the period drew from the atomic space age shapes and motifs that were going on. So you can expect, those kinds of patterns in the wallpaper. And then carpeting, the use of wall-to-wall carpeting was pretty ubiquitous after the war if you didn't have hardwood floors in, some of the rooms. And then window treatments, again, a really old invention by this point, the 1928 traverse rod. But because of the styles of architecture we had, right after its invention, not too many people had a use for a large curtain rod like that. It wasn't really until these big picture windows and large expanses of glass came into prominence in the American home that you needed a different system to draw those drapes closed at night. And actually, from these illustrations too, you can see the draperies were often one of the few places where you saw a pattern in the room because everything was a little more simplified. And then, of course, lighting, anything that looks like a rocket or a spaceship or a bomb. They made it into some kind of lighting fixture. And often, multifunctional, that you could move it around. If it was a desk lamp, you could move it into various directions. And you could swivel the wall sconce to your desires. And actually, they're reproducing those, I don't think they're actually pigskin, but it's like a faux leather shades from the 50s now. You've probably all seen like the multi-tiered things. So it's kind of funny what comes back into style. And then I'm going to end this with one slide of historic kitchens, because every time we do site visits with people, we often get the question, like, what did my kitchen look like? There's some people that ask us, oh, I want to go back to my 1920s kitchen. And I was like, are you really sure about that? But it's a really interesting just timeline in a very short period, not even 100 years, how much that room evolved, along with, our technological advances across the country. So, does anybody have any questions? I think not. Okay. Well, yes. Pardon? Well, with the turn of the century again, we've kind of moved to back to that mid-century modern. Anything that's sort of forward-looking. There's been an increased focus on that. And somebody last night asked me, like, so what's next? And when is Colonial going to come back? I'm like, Colonial's never going to go away. There's probably going to just come back, in ebbs and flows as we get tired of something that's too simple. So, and yeah, if anybody wants to take a look, there's a little display in the back. And last year when I first put this together, I put together this horrendously long bibliography. So if you want to know anything about the topic, there's books and magazines in there. But it's, it's always a learning experience. There's always something new to uncover, and, it was a lot of fun putting this together. So, yeah. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.